Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking what is honestly one of the most profound mysteries in all of ancient literature. We're going to look at how a single, incredibly specific phrase completely redefines the core of the Christian story. Seriously, it's this brilliant linguistic puzzle that turns human logic totally upside down, and honestly, the entire Gospel of John hinges right on it. So, let's just dive right into this counterintuitive theological riddle. How exactly could an execution be a coronation? I mean, normally we associate execution with utter defeat, right? Shame, the ultimate end of a story. But in the text we're analyzing today, an execution on a Roman cross is described as the exact moment a king is crowned and glorified. It's a massive paradox. So how does that actually work? Well, to figure it out, we've got to look closely at the specific words being used. Section 1. The mystery of lifted up. Okay, we're going to do a little linguistic detective work here. Right at the center of our mystery is a specific Greek word, hypsoo. It translates to lift up, but it carries this totally fascinating double meaning. So on one hand, it just means to physically raise something up, literally elevating it in space. But on the other hand, it has this figurative meaning, to exalt someone, to praise them, or elevate their status. When Jesus uses this word, he's setting up an absolutely incredible theological reversal. He deliberately chooses a word capable of carrying both of these meanings at the exact same time. You can see this dual meaning perfectly at play in this famous quote from John 12:32, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." Now, at first glance, you might think he just means, praised and exalted. But immediately after this quote, John adds an extraordinarily important editorial note. He writes, he said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. Boom! John makes it crystal clear. Jesus was directly referring to being physically suspended on the cross. But because of the word he chose, that physical lifting on the cross and the spiritual lifting in glory, they aren't two unrelated events. They are the exact same event, just viewed from two entirely different perspectives. Section 2. 3 clues in John. To really grasp how this paradox works, we actually need to trace this phrase chronologically through the gospel and watch how the meaning evolves. See, Jesus uses this specific expression during 3 major moments. Step 1 is in John 3, connecting the phrase to salvation. Step 2 is in John 8, connecting it to Revelation. And step 3 is in John 12, where the cross becomes this magnetic center, drawing all people to himself. Let's look closely at that very first clue. This brilliantly illustrates that first major step in John chapter 3. Jesus says, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up." This goes all the way back to the Old Testament book of Numbers. The Israelites were dying from poisonous snakes, right? So God had Moses put a bronze serpent on a pole. Anyone who looked at it lived. The instruction there was simply to look and live. And Jesus doesn't just say, "Hey, I'm going to die." No. He uses this ancient imagery to show that he's going to be raised up as a very public presentation. Just as dying people looked at that serpent to live, dying humanity can look to the Son of Man as the ultimate object of saving faith. Then we hit the second clue in John 8, where Jesus says, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he." Normally, a public execution proves that someone has lost, for sure. But here, the cross isn't just where Jesus dies, it's literally the ultimate place of revelation. It exposes everything about his true identity. It takes his obedience to the Father, his radical love, his self-sacrifice, and his absolute kingship and puts them all on full public display. This is exactly why the text speaks about his death as his actual glorification. Now let's move to our third clue, over in John chapter 12. Jesus says, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." But then, immediately, he starts talking about a grain of wheat falling into the earth to die. The sequence here is unmistakable. He is glorified, he dies, he is lifted up, he draws people, and he defeats Satan. John's entire theology of the cross is mapped out right here. Jesus' glorification doesn't happen after his crucifixion, it happens directly through it. Section 3, the ultimate theological reversal. To really feel the impact of this ultimate theological reversal, we've got to step into the historical and cultural context of the ancient world. You guys, this claim was absolutely shocking to first-century ears. To understand why, we have to understand what the cross actually was. Rome's intention for crucifixion wasn't just death, it was a tool for ultimate public humiliation. It was perfectly designed to completely strip a victim of their dignity, their honor, their social status, and their power. Rome was essentially suspending a person in the air to say to the whole world, look, this person is absolutely nothing. And the crucial point here is this rapid-fire irony. Jesus takes the ancient world's ultimate symbol of humiliation and completely transforms its meaning. Rome points to the cross and says, look at this defeated man. But Jesus points to the exact same cross and says, look at me and live. The cross was meant to make people look away in sheer horror, but Jesus makes it an attraction point, saying it's going to draw all people to him. The contrast is just staggering. Rome says, he's been conquered. He is completely powerless. We've raised him up as an example of shame. But God says, actually, I have raised him up as the savior of the world. God engineered an extraordinary theological reversal here, flipping literally every single human expectation about what power and victory look like. And you know what's really fascinating? The original crowds actually picked up on the physical meaning of the words. When Jesus said he would be lifted up, the crowd immediately responded by asking, wait, if the Messiah is supposed to remain forever, how can the Son of Man be lifted up? They knew lifted up meant execution. Their problem wasn't the vocabulary, it was the theology. It completely shattered their expectation of this untouchable, enthroned, conquering king. They expected victory to look like enthronement, right? But Jesus told them victory was going to look like crucifixion. But the thing is, this paradox wasn't entirely new. It actually had deep Old Testament roots. The prophet Isaiah wrote about a servant who would be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. But then, immediately after that, in Isaiah 53, that exact same servant is described as despised, rejected, pierced, and crushed for the sins of others. The biblical pattern was always there. Being lifted up and exalted was fundamentally tied to suffering and sacrifice. Which brings us to this incredibly powerful realization. The cross isn't an interruption of exaltation, it's the road to it. Lifted up doesn't just mean praised, and it doesn't just mean executed. Jesus was lifted up on the cross precisely in the process of being lifted up in glory. The physical lifting is the historical event, but the exaltation is the theological meaning of that event. You just simply cannot separate the two in John's gospel. Now, it's important to note that even Jesus' closest followers didn't get this right away. The pre-Easter disciples were constantly misunderstanding him. But John repeatedly tells us that after the resurrection, post-Easter, they looked backward and suddenly all the pieces fit. The cross gave the disciples the ultimate key for interpreting Jesus' earlier words. The resurrection didn't invent the meaning. It just proved what Jesus had been saying all along. Section 4. Redefining Greatness and Glory. Okay, we've done a lot of ancient textual analysis, but let's pivot for a second to what this source material means as a modern personal application. Because this brings us to a deeply uncomfortable yet kind of beautiful question. What kind of lifting up are you seeking? I mean, we all naturally want to be lifted up in the ordinary sense, right? We want the recognition, the success, the applause. We want ordinary elevation above others. We want to experience victory way before we experience sacrifice. But Jesus takes the very word we associate with elevation and literally bolts it to a cross. This creates a really stark contrast between the world's definition of greatness and Jesus' definition. The world tells us, you're great because others serve you. Exalt yourself. Avoid the cross at all costs. But Jesus completely redefines glory. He demonstrates that his absolute greatest display of glory wasn't when thousands applauded him. It was when he willingly gave himself for them. Jesus essentially says, you are great because you are willing to give yourself for others. Lose your life. This changes the fundamental question we should be asking about our lives. Instead of asking, how can I make sure I'm lifted up and recognized? This new paradigm asks, am I willing to let Christ be lifted up through me? It means that if we are given opportunities to be elevated, we use that platform to point upward to Christ, not inward to ourselves. And it means that if we face humiliation or suffering, we have to remember that humiliation does not necessarily equal failure. In fact, God's deepest work often happens in places that look, to humanize at least, like absolute defeat. Ultimately, the theology of the cross fundamentally redefines success. The greatest life gives itself most completely to God and to others. According to John's gospel, success just isn't about getting the most attention. It's entirely about self-giving love. And that leaves us with this final, lingering thought. The cross was not a defeat, but the path to true exaltation. The one who was lifted up in utter humiliation became the one who draws all of us upward. It's an extraordinary paradox that challenges everything we think we know about winning, losing, and true glory. So what does true elevation look like in your life? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this leaves you with plenty to think about today.